again, everybody. It's good to see each and every one of you here this morning, and I am really excited to talk to you about this text as we continue on in our sermon series, I Am Jesus in His Own Words. And the purpose of this series kind of came from me. I found this amazing video, and I showed it last week, so if you want to go to our YouTube page and watch last week's sermon, you'll be able to see that video. But essentially, these people went around to a park, and they interviewed people, and they asked them, who was Jesus, right? Who was or who is Jesus? And the plethora of answers that they received from people was really fascinating to me. Some people gave the answer that we might say the biblical answer, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Savior of the world. A lot of people said, I don't know, Jesus was a guy. One lady said he was a dude who had a beard, and that was her answer. I watched one video, a guy said that if David Copperfield had lived in Jesus' time, then he would have been Jesus. So apparently Jesus was a close-up magician, like a Vegas act. Again, right? And so we have all these opinions out there about who Jesus is. And so the purpose of this series is to examine 5 times in the Gospel of John where Jesus talks about himself, where he describes himself. And my hope is then that we would form our view and our opinion of who Jesus is based on his own words, right? Not based on our opinion or anything like that, but rather based on who Jesus tells us that he is. And this requires us to agree on 2 important things. I talked about this last week, and I'll probably talk about this each and every one of these sermons. But the first thing we have to agree on is that despite his theological motivations in writing this text, that John, the author of our text, has accurately described what Jesus said during his life. In other words, when John says, this is what Jesus said, this is what Jesus said. If we come to the text with so much skepticism about it actually being what Jesus said, then we're never going to get anywhere about actually determining who Jesus is from it. And then secondly, we need to evaluate Jesus' words not in the 21st century where we live, but in the 1st century where Jesus lived. If we try and evaluate what Jesus is saying here by 21st century standards, we're going to miss so much of his meaning. But as I'm going to show you, as we take it back to the context where Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world, we're going to see what an incredible statement that was. Now, for those of you who are currently in FFA, or like me, maybe were formerly in FFA and now are alumni, you'll probably remember these words describing the president's station during the opening ceremony. So the advisor says, why the president's place is beneath the rising sun. And then the advisor says, why is the president so stationed? And the vice president says this phrase. The rising sun is the token of a new era in agriculture. If we will follow the leadership of our president, we shall be led out of the darkness of selfishness and into the glorious sunlight of brotherhood and cooperation. Mr. or Madam President, all officers are at their stations. Now, as I was thinking about those words this week, which I've heard many, many times, I realized that they take a very pessimistic view of human nature. I mean, think about this. We shall be led out of the darkness of selfishness. The assumption underlying that is that humans do not default to brotherhood and cooperation. That instead our default as humans is selfishness. And I'm like, man, that's really pessimistic of a view to take about human beings. But here's the incredible thing. John, the author of our gospel, he agrees with that assessment of human nature. In chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, this is what John has to say. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light so that his deeds will not be exposed. Okay, so throughout his gospel, the author John uses this theme of dark and light to describe the world. And he defines here in chapter 3 what he means by darkness, right? And for those of you who were here for our first series, Foundations of Faith, you probably know what I'm going to say here. John is talking about the sinful heart, right? The sinful heart. Not the sinful actions that the sinful heart brings into the world necessarily, but the heart of sin itself, which is, and again, I'm hopeful that you all have heard this enough now that you're starting to be able where you can repeat it, but essentially, the sinful heart is my inborn desire to reject God and make myself Lord, make myself God of my life, to determine for myself what is the right and what is the wrong thing to do. And John says what this brings into the world is darkness, right? Out of my rejection of God comes a lack of love for God and a lack of love for my neighbors. Comes selfishness, comes hatred, comes bigotry, comes injustice. All of these things come out of the darkness of my sinful heart. And so if that's the darkness, then the question that obviously follows is, well then what is the light? What is the light that's going to come into this darkness and overcome the darkness? And that's where we get to our passage today. So I hope that as we look at our passage today, we're all going to be able to see that Jesus is the light that overcomes the darkness of sin. Jesus is the light that overcomes the darkness of sin. All right, before we jump into the actual verses of our passage today, again, we need to set the context, right? We need to look at Jesus in the context where he's saying these words. So, Jesus, when he says this, he's in the city of Jerusalem. This is the capital city of the region where Jesus lived during his life. And it's during what's called the Festival of Tabernacles. And this was a celebration that Jewish people had every single year where they would make a pilgrimage from wherever they lived, and they would all come to Jerusalem, and they would pitch these very primitive kind of tents in Jerusalem. And it was a celebration of how God had provided for the people in the wilderness, right, when they were all living in tents, moving towards the promised land. But also, in Jesus' day, there was also this messianic expectation part of the celebration, right? People were looking for the Messiah. And in particular, what they wanted the Messiah to be was this conquering king who was going to come, who was going to free them from their bondage to Rome and would reestablish Israel as an independent nation. And so there's all of these expectations in this Festival of Tabernacles. But one of the traditions of the festival was to light 4 massive lamps in the temple, which is kind of in the center of the city. It's at the highest point of the city. And Jewish commenters who were alive at that time tell us that the light from these 4 lamps was so bright that it could be seen anywhere in the city. Like no matter where you were walking in Jerusalem, you could see light emanating from the temple. And so it's in the context of these 4 massive lamps and the light that they give to the city that Jesus claims that he is the true light of the world. All right, with all that set, let's look at our text. Look with me again at chapter 8, verse 12. Then Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Okay, so Jesus is standing in the temple, and he's addressing both an audience of lay Jewish people, right? People who were part of the Jewish faith, but weren't necessarily preachers or teachers or scholars. They were just average, everyday Jewish people who had come for the celebration. And the other group of people who's in the temple are the respected rabbis and teachers who the people are coming to listen to. And Jesus falls into this group. I mean, he's amassed quite a stir around him as a very powerful rabbi at this point. And Jesus makes this claim that he is the light of the world. Now, obviously, he's referencing the light from the lamps of the temple, but he's corresponding with the messianic expectations of the festival. Like, if we're at the Festival of Tabernacles and some guy who's really, really famous and who has shown the ability to work miracles starts saying, I am the light of the world, people start to get tense because they're like, is he saying he's the Messiah? Because we've been waiting for the Messiah. We really want the Messiah. Are you the Messiah? Like, is that what you're saying? There's a lot of tension around that statement. And what's even crazier about this is, unlike the other rabbis and teachers who would call people to submit and follow Yahweh, Jesus says, the one who follows me will not walk in darkness. So Jesus is not just saying, follow God, but follow me. That's a pretty incredible claim of Jesus to make. And he says that those who follow him as the light will never walk in darkness. So for those of you who were here last week, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And whenever Jesus uses these metaphors in the I am statements, there's always a corresponding response from the people, right? The one who responds to Jesus in that way. So last week it's, I am the bread of life. The one who comes to me will never be hungry, and the one who believes in me will never be thirsty. Well, okay, just like last week now, Jesus is saying, I am the light. The one who believes in me and follows me will never walk in darkness. So always be on the lookout for that dynamic when we're looking at these I am statements. Okay, but it's not just the light that they're not just going to not walk in darkness, but they will have the light of life. So since we've established that darkness means the sinful heart, and as we look at the breadth of Scripture, the sinful heart always leads to death. Right? From Genesis 3 onward, it is our sinful hearts that lead to the consequence, the punishment of death. But then the light, if the light is overcoming the darkness, then Jesus is offering to those who follow him a life that is free from sin and thus free from death. Right? It's the light of life. Where it's the darkness of death, we get the light of life. All right, so Jesus has made this bold claim, and there's a couple people in the temple who aren't too happy with what he's just said. And so that leads us to verses 13 and 14. So the Pharisees said to him, you are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Jesus answered and said to them, even if I am testifying about myself, my testimony is true, because I know where I came from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. So Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees. Now this is a sect or a group in Judaism. It was very popular during Jesus' day. And they believed that by strictly observing every single law from the Old Testament, that God would bless them and would send them the Messiah. And they would overthrow the Roman Empire. Now their objection to Jesus is that he is claiming to be the light of the world, but he lacks another witness to back up this claim. The need for multiple witnesses to establish something as a fact was a part of Jewish law. And so obviously the Pharisees, the real sticklers for the law, are saying, you can't just make this claim that you're the light of the world, Jesus. You need someone else to also tell us that you're the light of the world. And thus far, it's just you saying it. So we shouldn't believe you, right? Your testimony is not true. You haven't established it as a fact. Now, earlier in the gospel, Jesus has said that everything he does and everything he says is only as the Father tells him to do and tells him to say. So he can make these amazing claims like the one in verse 12, and he's confident that they're true, not because he says it, but because God himself is telling him to say it. God the Father is telling God the Son to say these things. And so Jesus is certain that what he is saying is true. But his retort to the Pharisees here is slightly different. Jesus says that his testimony is true because he knows where he is coming from, that is, from God the Father, and that he knows where he's going, that is, to the cross, where he will make atonement for the sins of the world, and then ultimately to the right hand of the Father, right? That only the light of the world would go to the right hand of the Father. And so because Jesus knows that's where he's going, he is certain that his testimony is true. And obviously his opponents don't know either of these things. If they knew that Jesus was the Son of God, sent to cleanse the world from sin, and that he was going to be at the right hand of the Father, then they would agree with him that Jesus is the light of the world. But because they don't know these things, Jesus says they are unfit to make judgments about him. And Jesus continues on in verses 15 and 16. Again, Jesus says, "You judge according to the flesh," or I think our translation here in the church says human standards. "You judge according to the flesh, but I am not judging anyone. But even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone in it, but I and the Father who sent me." So the Pharisees are looking at Jesus only in human terms. Like their minds are limited, and they can only look at Jesus as a man. Just a man. That's how they see him. And again, watching that video, there were a lot of people who view Jesus just as a man. A man who came to teach moral lessons about being nice to others, and that's it. That's all Jesus is to them, just a man. But of course, this is the very reason that they can't accept that he is the light of the world. If they considered the possibility, what if Jesus is more than just a man? What if he's the Son of God? What if he is God come down to us in human flesh? Well, if that was true, then such a claim of being the light of the world would not seem so far-fetched. Jesus, on the other hand, he says he never judges anyone based on such limited criteria. Not that Jesus never judges, but rather that he never judges in the way that the Pharisees judge. And furthermore, Jesus says, whenever I do make a judgment, it is always true. It is always perfect. It is always just. Why? Because he and the Father are in agreement about the judgment. Right? And that's the legal standard. That's two separate people, right? God is a Trinity, one God, three persons. But that means two separate persons are in agreement about the judgment that Jesus is making. All right, let's look at verses 17 and 18. "Even in your law it has been written that the testimony of two people is true. I am he who testifies about myself, and the Father who sent me testifies about me." So, if this is true, then Jesus' judgment that he is the light of the world must be true. Because Jesus would not have arrived at this conclusion that he is the light of the world unless he and the Father were in perfect agreement that that was the case. Therefore, Jesus concludes that it's not just him who is claiming that he is the light of the world, but Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Isaac and Jacob. This God is saying, this man right here is the light of the world. And we are in agreement about that judgment. And I love the Pharisees, in typical Pharisee fashion, just completely misunderstand Jesus here. Verse 19, "So they were saying to him, 'Where is your Father?' And Jesus answered, 'You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also.'" The response of the Pharisees is to ask Jesus, "Okay, you said your Father will also testify that you are the light of the world. Could you please bring your Father forward so we can hear from him?" And again, they're doing the exact thing Jesus accused them of doing in verse 15. They're judging purely by fleshly or human standards, right? They're looking for Jesus' earthly father. And Jesus' response is, this is a heavy accusation that he lays on them. He says, "You don't know me because you don't know my Father." You don't know my Father. Think about this. These are the most respected religious leaders in Jerusalem. These are the leaders of the Jews. These are the people who teach them about who God is and what he's like. And Jesus says, you do not know God. It would be like someone coming up to me in the middle of church right now and saying, "Pastor Dawson, you don't know God. Like, you don't know Jesus. Why are you getting up here and teaching us? You don't know him." That's the accusation that Jesus is laying at the feet of the Pharisees here. They know about God, but they don't know God. Because if they knew God, then they would know that Jesus is telling the truth, that he is the light of the world that overcomes the darkness of sin. All right, now we get this little conclusion in verse 20. "These words he spoke in the treasury." So this is John, our author, kind of interjecting and giving some context to this whole exchange. "These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. So we get this, okay, so here's where Jesus was. He's in the temple. He's in the treasury area of the temple when he says this. But most importantly, John wants to explain to us, and here's why Jesus wasn't immediately arrested for telling the religious elite that they didn't know God. Right? You might read this, especially John's original audience of young Christians would have read this and been like, so Jesus just accused these very powerful men of not knowing God, and they already don't like Jesus, so why didn't they just arrest him right here? And John says it's because his hour had not yet come. And again, just like there's a theme of light and dark in John, there's also this theme of the hour. So whenever you're reading the Gospel of John and you hear about Jesus' hour, we're always talking about Jesus' death on the cross. In the first miracle in the book of John is Jesus turning water to wine at a wedding in Cana. And when Jesus' mother approaches him about this problem of the people at the wedding running out of wine, he says, "Woman, what is that to me? Don't you know my hour has not yet come?" Right? So even at a wedding, Jesus is thinking about his eventual death on the cross, which is kind of morbid a little bit. But the point John is making here is that Jesus isn't arrested because the time has not yet come for him to be lifted up on the cross and make atonement for sin. There are still things that the Father needs him to do and the Father needs him to say before Jesus can go to the cross. Jesus is the light that overcomes the darkness of sin. I'm sure that all of us have been through a time that we would describe as dark. And I'm sure we can all think of times that we have brought darkness into the world. When we spoke in unkindness or untruth, when we decided in our own hearts, I'm going to do what I think is right and wrong to do in this situation. And the result of that was hurting someone, was not honoring who God made them to be. And we brought darkness into the world. But listen to what Jesus says about himself. That he is the light that will overcome the darkness in the world, that will overcome the darkness that we have brought into the world. And the question for us is, how will we respond to that? Will we be like the Pharisees and say, well, he's just a guy. What does he know about anything? Or will we believe him at his word? Will we believe that he and the Father are in agreement that he is the light of the world who overcomes the darkness of sin? Jesus calls us to follow him as the light and to live in the light of life, to overcome the darkness of our lives and to live in his light and to have eternal, fulfilling life. Again, for those of you who were last week, right, that's what Jesus is offering to people as the bread of life. And he says, I'm the bread of life. It's not just that you're going to exist forever, but you're going to exist forever in this perfect, content, full, joyous state for all of eternity. And how? How do we do this? Paul makes it so clear. The way to start following Jesus is to confess with our mouths that he is Lord and to believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead. 3 days after he's crucified, he makes atonement for our sin. God raises him back to life to show us that he will raise us back to life through Jesus. Jesus offers us forgiveness, redemption from our darkness. And so, I pose it to you this way. Maybe you as FFA members or former FFA members will hear it this way and understand even better what I'm trying to say to you. If we will follow the leadership of Jesus, our Messiah, we shall be led out of the darkness of sin and death and into the glorious sunlight of eternal life with him forever and ever. Amen.